The fever comes first, then the vomiting. Then, one by one, the small ones stop crying because they no longer have the strength to cry. It has been 11 days since the first child fell sick, and now 4 are dead, and the healers of the tribe, the strongest hunters, the sharpest trackers, the ones who can bring down a bison at a dead run, stand around the fire with nothing to offer but silence. They have never seen a sickness like this one, but someone here has. She is the oldest person for 100 miles. Her hands shake. She cannot run, cannot climb, cannot carry her own water anymore. By the cruel math of survival, she should have been left behind years ago. And in a few minutes, she is going to save the only future this tribe has left, because 60 winters ago, as a little girl, she watched her own grandmother mash a specific bark into a paste, force it down a dying child's throat, and watch that child live. This is not a story about medicine. This is a story about something far bigger. At some point in the deep past, a strange and almost unbelievable thing happened to our species. Early humans started doing something no animal before us had ever done on purpose. We started keeping our old people alive, feeding them long after they could hunt for themselves, protecting them long after they could protect anyone else. And that one decision, made around campfires tens of thousands of years ago, did not just save a few lives here and there. It built civilization. It is the reason you can read this sentence right now, instead of one more skeleton in the fossil record. So what exactly did these old men and women know that was worth all those extra mouths to feed for decades? The answer is stranger and more moving than you think. Let's start with something in nature that should not make sense. A Pacific salmon fights its way hundreds of miles upstream, spawns once, and is dead within days. A male octopus mates a single time and simply stops eating, wasting away until he dies while still guarding his own eggs. In evolutionary terms, the logic is cold and simple. Once you can no longer pass on your genes, your body has no further use to nature, so nature lets it fall apart. That is the rule for almost every living thing that has ever existed. Humans break it. A woman can live 30, 40, even 50 years past the point where she can have another child. That is not a minor footnote in biology. That is an outrage against it. Evolution does not build expensive machines and then let them idle for decades doing nothing useful. For a long time, nobody could explain why prehistoric humans, fighting for every calorie, would keep feeding people who could no longer have babies. The mystery sat unanswered until an anthropologist walked into the East African bush in the 1980s and watched something that would quietly rewrite the story of our entire species. Her name was Kristen Hawkes, and she was studying the Hadza, a community of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania who still live something close to the way our ancestors did. Hawkes expected to find what every documentary had already told her to expect. Strong young men striding home with fresh meat, the mighty hunter as hero. What she actually found broke that story completely. Hadza hunters, even the best of them, come home without big game far more often than they come home with it. So who was actually putting food on the ground, reliably enough to keep children alive? It was the grandmothers. The old women of the camp, who could no longer bear children of their own, spent hours every day in the punishing heat, digging into rock-hard soil for tubers, roots buried so deep they required real strength and decades of accumulated knowledge to even find. Children weren't strong enough to dig that deep. Young mothers were too busy nursing infants, but the grandmothers had both the time and the muscle memory of a lifetime, and they used it to feed everyone. Here's the part that changes everything. When a grandmother feeds her grandchildren, she isn't just adding calories to the pot, she is freeing her own daughter's body. A young mother who has to gather every calorie her children need can usually only manage one dependent child at a time. She has to wait years between births. But give that mother a grandmother in camp, and the math changes completely. Now there's a second forager, a second set of hands. The mother can wean sooner. She can conceive again sooner. The family doesn't just survive, it grows. This is called the grandmother hypothesis, and what it suggests is almost too beautiful to be true, that the reason humans spread across every continent on Earth, the reason there are now more than 8 billion of us, was never really about our spears, or our fire, or even our oversized brains on their own. It was about grandmothers. The women that nature's own rulebook said should have been discarded turned out to be the engine that built the entire human race. And it isn't only a story anthropologists tell about hunter-gatherers today. In the 2000s, a researcher named Mirkka Lahdenperä went digging, not into soil, but into old church registers from 18th and 19th century Finland and Canada, where births, deaths, and family lines had been meticulously recorded for generations. She wanted to know, did having a living grandmother actually change anything in real, documented human families, long before modern medicine existed? It did. Children with a living maternal grandmother nearby were significantly more likely to survive childhood, and women who lived longer after menopause ended up with more surviving grandchildren. Two completely different lines of evidence, one from watching hunter-gatherers dig tubers under the African sun, the other from reading 200-year-old parish records in the Finnish cold, and both point to the same conclusion. Grandmothers were never a burden the species tolerated out of sentiment. They were calculated into how many of us made it to adulthood. If that just gave you chills, if you're realizing right now that you exist because some woman decades past her own childbearing years refused to stop working for her family, then stay with me, because the grandmothers were only half of what kept this species alive. There was a second kind of survival, and it had nothing to do with food. Imagine a world with no books, no writing, nothing recorded anywhere, ever. That was reality for the overwhelming majority of human existence. Now ask yourself something unsettling. In a world like that, where does knowledge actually live? It lives in a skull. That's the whole library. There's an old saying, often credited to the Malian writer Amadou Hampâté-Bâ, that captures this perfectly. When an old man dies, a library burns to the ground. In the Ice Age, that wasn't poetry. It was a fact of survival. Every flood an elder had lived through, every plant they'd learned was safe the hard way, existed nowhere else. A tribe with old people had access to information no young person could possibly have. A tribe without them was flying blind. Picture a coastal community where the sea has always behaved the same way. Then one day the water pulls back, farther than anyone alive has ever seen it go. Younger adults walk out onto the newly exposed seabed to grab stranded fish. One person screams for everyone to run the other way, the oldest woman in camp, because she saw this exact thing happen once before, as a small child, right before a wall of water swallowed the shoreline whole. Because she remembers, and is believed, the tribe survives a catastrophe, a young hunter, running on instinct alone, would have walked straight into. This is not invention. Along the coastlines of Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions describe islands and hunting grounds swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, more than 7,000 years ago. Researchers who cross-checked these stories against sea level data found the geography matched coastlines that vanished thousands of years before anyone could write anything down. Across roughly 300 generations, passed mouth to ear, the memory of a lost coastline survived. That is the oldest data storage system our species ever built, and it depended on people living long enough and being listened to long enough to pass it on. Now here's where the story gets even stranger, because scientists found a way to prove that old people becoming common was a real, datable event in our history, and they proved it using teeth. A paleoanthropologist named Rachel Caspari spent years studying wear patterns on hundreds of fossilized human teeth, which erode predictably as a person ages. She used this to compare the ratio of older adults to younger adults across hundreds of thousands of years of the fossil record. For most of prehistory, that ratio barely moved. Surviving into old age was rare, almost a fluke, but starting around 30 to 40,000 years ago, the number of people living to old age roughly doubled. For the first time, grandparents stopped being the exception. And the timing lines up almost exactly with one of the most explosive periods in the archaeological record, what's sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. After hundreds of thousands of years of near silence, we suddenly see cave paintings so alive, they still stop visitors in their tracks. At sites like Chauvet and Lascaux, we see engraved ochre and shell beads going back over 70,000 years at Blombos Cave in South Africa. We see sewing needles, fish hooks, ritual burial. A single person can learn to make a tool in their lifetime, but it takes an elder, someone who lived years longer, to actually teach it. For the first time, human communities weren't starting from zero every generation. They were stacking knowledge, one lifetime on top of the last, and that stack eventually became civilization, which raises a darker question. If grandparents were this powerful, what happened to the humans who didn't have them? This brings us to the Neanderthals. For decades, popular imagination painted them as brutish cave dwellers. That picture has been demolished. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, cared for injured group members well enough that some survived years with disabilities that should have killed them. And yet they vanished, while a newer arrival, us, spread across the planet. There's no single explanation for Neanderthal extinction. Small population sizes, climate shifts, and interbreeding with incoming Homo sapiens all likely played a role. But Caspari's tooth data adds an eerie piece to the puzzle. Neanderthal populations show far fewer old individuals than the modern humans living alongside them, hunting the same animals, in the same landscape. Fewer elders, fewer living libraries. It may not be the whole reason they disappeared, but it's likely one thread in it. They weren't the only close relatives we lost. In 2010, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, researchers pulled a fragment of a finger bone from the sediment, too small to look like much of anything. Its DNA belonged to neither a modern human nor a Neanderthal, but to an entire lost population we now call the Denisovans, known almost exclusively from a handful of bone fragments. They're not fully gone. Our ancestors met them and had children with them. Today, people from Melanesia and Aboriginal Australia carry some of the highest levels of Denisovan DNA on Earth. Somewhere out there, right now, someone is carrying pieces of a people whose grandparents, whose fireside stories, whose decades of survival knowledge, were completely erased from memory. We are the last twig on a family tree that used to be crowded. Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, others we may never find evidence of. And one quiet thread running through who made it and who didn't may be this simple: whether a community kept its old people alive long enough to teach what they knew. Humans aren't the only animals that stumbled onto this trick. Killer whales are one of the vanishingly few species where females live for decades after they stop reproducing, just like human women. Researchers at the University of Exeter found this trait has independently evolved in at least 5 species of toothed whale, including orcas, belugas, and narwhals. In every case, females live for decades past their reproductive years, sticking close to their pods instead of drifting off to die alone. Scientists studying orca pods found something almost identical to the human story. When salmon runs failed, the pods most likely to survive were led by an old, post-reproductive female because she remembered where the fish had gone during the last bad year, sometimes decades earlier. Pods that lost their oldest female during a lean year saw sharply higher death rates among their young. The same law of nature, showing up twice, independently, in species separated by tens of millions of years of evolution. When survival depends on rare knowledge, the old become priceless. Bring this down to solid ground. The coldest nights of the Ice Age, snow past your knees, temperatures that would kill an unprepared person within hours. Strength matters, but strength alone doesn't beat a season like this. Knowledge does. The elder who knows how to bank a fire so it survives until dawn, because he's done it 10,000 times. The old woman who knows how to layer hide so the wind can't find a gap, how to ration food so it lasts the dark months, which dried berries are safe and which will kill a child by morning. None of that is instinct. It's decades of trial, error, and memory. Grandparents weren't a luxury the tribe carried out of kindness. They were the operating system the whole camp ran on. And once you understand that, something in your own chest probably makes more sense. Most of us feel something automatic around our own grandparents, a pull to protect them, a reflex to listen when they speak. We file that under sweetness. It isn't just that. It's biology, running code that's hundreds of thousands of years old. The communities that protected their elders tended to survive. The ones that abandoned them, more often, did not. The affection you feel for an elderly relative may be one of the sharpest survival tools evolution ever built into us, wiring us to protect the very people who once protected us. It goes even deeper than survival skills, because grandparents didn't only keep us alive physically. They gave us something that made us who we are. Picture a fire 50,000 years ago. Children press close against the cold, and the oldest person in camp starts to speak. About a flood her own grandmother survived. About where their people came from. This, right here, is the birth of human history. And those stories were never just entertainment. They were survival manuals wearing a disguise children would pay attention to. A tale about a monster in a river was often a coded warning: don't swim there. A legend about an angry mountain spirit was sometimes the folk memory of a real eruption, repackaged to survive being retold badly 100 times over. Almost every human culture has some version of the elder around the fire archetype, because the old pass the past to the young, so the young have something solid enough to build a future on. But there was a brutal weakness hidden inside this system. If your library is a person, your library can die in a single bad night, a fall, a fever, an accident on a hunt. Imagine a community where only one elder knows where the clean water is in a drought year, or which mushroom looks almost exactly like a safe one but will kill by morning, and that person dies before they finish passing it on. In a single afternoon, decades of hard-won knowledge ceased to exist. This almost certainly happened again and again throughout prehistory, entire small groups quietly vanishing not because of war or predators, but because of forgetting. Which is why the smartest communities didn't rely on a single elder. They spread the knowledge around, deliberately, so no single death could erase it all at once. Strip that down and it's the ancestor of every school that has ever existed. A classroom is an organized, scaled-up version of an elder making sure a child knows which plant not to eat before it's too late to learn the hard way. There's a myth worth killing here, because you've probably heard it stated as fact, that ancient humans routinely died around 30, that old age basically didn't exist. It's wrong. The number doing the damage is average life expectancy, and yes, in prehistoric populations that average often sat around 30. But it's a statistical trap, dragged down by infant and child mortality. A huge number of people died before age 5, and those early deaths pull the average down in a way that has almost nothing to do with how long people lived once they survived to adulthood. Researchers who study hunter-gatherer demographics directly have found that if you made it through the dangerous early years, your realistic chance of living into your 60s or 70s was very real. Old people were rarer than today, but they existed in essentially every human community ever studied. Every tribe had its survivors, its keepers. Living that long, though, created a strange problem of its own, one so large that grandparents may be the only reason we ever solved it. A newborn deer can run from a predator on its first day alive. A human baby cannot hold its own head up. It cannot walk for a year, cannot feed itself for years after that, and needs close, constant care for the better part of a decade. Why would evolution build something so catastrophically helpless? Because of the brain inside its skull, so large that babies have to be born before it finishes developing. Simply because a fully developed head would no longer fit through the birth canal, we arrive unfinished, and stay unfinished for years. A decade of total dependency is an extraordinary risk in the wild, and the math only works with help. The most valuable help was a woman who was done having her own children and could pour everything she had into someone else's. It's worth adding what the grandmother hypothesis alone doesn't fully explain. Researchers like Hillard Kaplan, studying the Ake people of Paraguay, found that older men mattered enormously too, not primarily by gathering food, but by holding on to extraordinarily difficult, slow-to-master skills, like tracking dangerous game, and spending years passing those skills to younger hunters. Grandmothers bought the time. Grandfathers, in many communities, filled it with expertise nobody else in camp possessed. It took both halves of an aging population, working differently, to build a childhood long enough for a brain like ours to finish growing. Which means the equation, stripped all the way down, looks like this. No elders to buy the time and pass down the skill, no long, protected childhood, no long childhood, no room for an oversized, slow-developing brain to safely exist. No brain like that, no human evolution as we know it, no you, watching this right now. For roughly 300,000 years, that arrangement held, and in the span of just a couple of generations, quietly, we started dismantling it. For the entire span of human history, the old were the most valuable members of any community, protected, consulted, fed first in hard times. Today, in much of the world, they're often the first sidelined, treated like their knowledge has an expiration date, replaced by a search bar that answers faster and never gets tired of the question. Maybe that trait is fine. Maybe a search engine really is a better library than any single human memory could ever be. But there are things it cannot give you that a person can. The look in an elder's eyes when they tell you what their own life actually felt like from the inside. The sense of being one link in something enormous and old that started long before you and, if you're lucky, will keep going long after. That cannot be downloaded. It only exists inside a person, and when that person is gone, it's gone completely, the way it has been gone for every human who ever failed to pass their knowledge on in time. Which brings us back to where we started. To that old woman by the fire, the one who should have been useless by nature's cold arithmetic, but who instead spent her final strength mashing bark into a paste, because 60 years earlier, someone had thought she was worth teaching. Every person watching this right now is, in a very real sense, the finish line of an unbroken relay race that has been running for hundreds of thousands of years. A baton carried through ice ages, through famines, through the extinction of the Neanderthals, and the quiet disappearance of the Denisovans, handed down, fire to fire, elder to child, all the way to